All right, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. So back to here. So when we talk about the corollaries, if a quadrilateral is a rhombus, that means it has four congruent sides. Let me pick a different color. Four congruent. All right. So four congruent sides. That is enough for me to tell it that it is a quadrilateral and is a rhombus at that point. Um, as for a rectangle must always have 90-degree angles. That's very important. To be part of a rectangle, it must have that. And what's the difference between that and a square? Well, a square will also have four 90-degree angles, but they will also be equal sides. So that works with that. Now let's talk about diagonals. Diagonals are, like we already talked about, when they go across like this. So there's important rules with these three and diagonals. The first thing is for a rhombus, if you had a diagonal, the diagonals always make a 90 degree. And that's very, very important. That's what differentiates a rhombus. It makes a 90-degree angle. Now, if I were to take a rhombus and I also did diagonals, there's something else that you can point from this. Rhombus diagonals will always break the angles or bisect the angles. So they'll always bisect the angles into half. That's another thing about it. And the last thing is about rectangles. So if a rectangle, I had draw diagonals, the two diagonals that I drew will be congruent to each other. So let's label this A, B, C, D. Then I can say in this case that AC is congruent to BD. So that's the rule about diagonals. So we're going to move on now onto trapezoids. A trapezoid has two parallel bases. So let me draw that. One base and then a second base, and they are parallel. And then they have, and I'll draw this with a different color, two legs. And that is a definition of a trapezoid. So let's work with this trapezoid. We have two bases that are parallel to each other and then two legs. The first thing you want to know is about a trapezoid. Right. If the trapezoid's legs are congruent, they're both equal, the two red legs, we call this an isosceles trapezoid. And if the trapezoid is isosceles, that means two things. That means that right over here, these are going to be equal to each other, these two bottom ones, and these two top ones are going to equal each other also. So that's one of the things we know about isosceles. Another thing we know about isosceles is kind of like the rectangle, but if I were to draw diagonals on an isosceles triangle, they would equal each other. So once again, I'm going to label these. And so I would say AC is congruent to BD. So that's the whole thing about isosceles triangles. One other major concept comes down to an isosceles triangle, and let me go here, draw out another triangle. And actually, this doesn't necessarily have to be an isosceles triangle. This is any triangle. If I took halfway point here and the halfway point over here between, let's say, so if I took the halfway point between A and D right here and the halfway point between B and C, you guys remember this from when we did the triangles. This is called a mid-segment. The mid-segment is actually the average of the two bases, and not only that, all three are parallel. So all three will be parallel to each other. Now remember, the two bases are already parallel. The mid-segment is also going to be parallel. And that means because of the mid-segment, these things are congruent to each other. Another thing about the mid-segment, remember the area of a trapezoid is 1/2 base 1 plus base 2 times the height. The height is like this in black. It is not the leg. So if I were to take this portion and average out the bases, I will get exactly this mid-segment right here. Is AB. So I'll write this as AB, and then this is going to be DC. If I average those out, I get the mid-segment. And we'll move on to the last major concept, which is a kite. Now I'm going to use the diamond to draw the kite. The thing about kites are there's two main things. First of all, a quadrilateral is a kite if the diagonals, so let me draw the diagonals. So if the diagonals of a are at a 90-degree angle, I mean, first of all, if it's a kite, let me see, the two sides, then the diagonals will be 90 degrees. Now we saw this again in a rhombus. So just because the diagonals are 180 degrees doesn't mean it's only a kite. We saw the same thing on a rhombus. However, there's a thing about a kite. And a kite, let me erase all of these. The two sides will be the same and the other two sides will be the same. However, in a kite, only two angles will be the same. So if these two angles are congruent, then this one and these one are not congruent. And similarly, if I do it the opposite way, if this angle and this angle are congruent, then these are not congruent. And that's the major thing about a kite. And inshallah, this is basically all of the chapter. The major concepts are understanding and organizing this. What is a parallelogram? What is a square? What is a rectangle, a kite, trapezoid? How they associate with each other? Which one is which and which one is not? So you just need to go over that, and I think 8.6 does that beautifully, and hopefully your 8.6 homework with that chart will help you organize that. Please make sure you follow along with the trapezoid kite sheet, the sheet that I gave you with the huge, where you have to work out the interior angles. There was a chart, and the last one was a parallelogram sheet. Do study those. All right, inshallah, you guys will do well on the test. Assalamu alaikum.